Before they were ruins, before they were footnotes, before they vanished into ash, stone, or memory, these buildings stood as declarations. They rose from earth and ambition together, shaped by hands that believed permanence was possible. Each belonged to a specific time and place, yet all were born from the same human instinct, to leave a mark so solid that history itself would have to step around it. In the ancient world, cities were not merely settlements. They were statements of power carved into landscape. In Mesopotamia, temples of mud brick climbed skyward in tiered steps, shimmering under the sun with glazed tiles and ritual fire. In Egypt, stone was not chosen for beauty alone, but for eternity. Columns were aligned with stars, walls were etched with prayers meant to outlive flesh. Architecture was theology made physical. Across the Mediterranean, marble cities took form. In Athens, Rome, and later Constantinople, buildings were designed to organize the world. Law, commerce, worship, spectacle, each assigned its proper space beneath towering roofs and vaulted domes. Streets echoed with sandals and carts, while shadows from colonnades cooled the heat of empire. These structures framed daily life, but they also framed belief that civilization was ascending, orderly, unstoppable. Farther east, imperial capitals bloomed behind walls of brick and earth. Palaces aligned with cosmic principles, gates positioned to harmonize heaven and ruler. In China, wooden halls rested on stone platforms, painted in deep reds and golds, rebuilt again and again as dynasties turned over. Permanence here was not resistance to change, but mastery over renewal. In the Islamic world, architecture followed trade routes and faith. Mosques, libraries, and palaces rose in cities like Baghdad, Damascus, and Cordoba. Domes floated above courtyards filled with water and shade. Geometry ruled decoration, not to impress the eye alone, but to reflect divine order. These buildings were places of prayer, learning, and governance, inseparable from daily life. Medieval Europe followed a different rhythm. Castles grew from rock, their walls thick with fear and ambition. Cathedrals took centuries to complete, stone lifted skyward by generations who would never see the final vault closed. Towns clustered around these monuments, their lives measured by bells, markets, and seasons. Architecture here was slow, deliberate, and deeply communal. Then came the age of spectacle. Renaissance palaces displayed wealth through symmetry and scale. Baroque structures bent stone into motion, facades rippling with drama. In the Americas, civilizations like the Maya and Inca built cities that aligned with solstices and mountains, temples rising like stairways to the sky. These were not primitive structures, but sophisticated expressions of astronomy, governance, and belief. Each of the 10 buildings remembered in this story emerged from such contexts. They were shaped by geography, deserts, rivers, hills, coastlines. They were shaped by politics, empires expanding, rulers competing, faiths asserting dominance. And they were shaped by ordinary life, workers hauling stone, artisans carving detail, priests chanting, merchants passing beneath arches on their way to market. Yet even at their birth, tension lingered. No building is ever truly finished. Maintenance is a promise that must be kept, and power is never static. Wars loomed beyond horizons. Earthquakes waited beneath foundations. Trade routes shifted. Religions changed hands. Climate, economy, and ambition pressed constantly against stone walls. At their first light, these buildings seemed invincible. Their silhouettes dominated skylines. Their interiors swallowed sound and light alike. To stand before them was to feel small, and to believe that whoever commanded such structures must command time itself. History, however, has never honored such confidence. At their height, these buildings were not silent monuments. They breathed with human presence. Dawn began with footsteps echoing through corridors, doors opening to courtyards, smoke rising from hearths and lamps. Priests, officials, servants, scholars, soldiers, each moved according to invisible hierarchies encoded in architecture itself. Power was measured in access. Who could enter the inner chamber? Who could stand beneath the central dome? Who was kept outside, gazing upward? Palaces controlled movement with walls and gates. Temples guided the faithful through carefully choreographed spaces. Architecture taught obedience long before words were spoken. Trade flowed through these structures. Warehouses, markets, ports, and caravanserais connected distant worlds. Goods passed under arches that had never known silence: spices, silk, grain, gold. With trade came wealth, and with wealth came expansion. Buildings grew larger, more ornate, more daring. Height and scale became tools of competition, cities striving to outshine rivals across rivers and seas. Religion intensified this rivalry. Sacred buildings were statements of divine favor. When faiths changed, buildings often changed with them. A temple became a church became a mosque, inscriptions carved over, symbols replaced. Stone endured, meaning shifted, yet such transformations were rarely peaceful. Conflict followed belief like a shadow. Wars tested architecture brutally. Fortresses proved their worth under siege. Palaces became targets. Temples were looted or burned. Some buildings survived assaults only to fall later from neglect. Others were deliberately erased, their destruction meant as a warning or a cleansing. To destroy a building was to attack memory itself. Natural forces were equally relentless. Earthquakes cracked domes that had stood for centuries. Floods undermined foundations laid too close to rivers. Fires swept through wooden cities, reducing marvels to ash overnight. In some cases, rebuilding followed. In others, abandonment settled like dust. As empires declined, maintenance faltered. Roofs leaked. Stone was quarried from old walls to build new homes. Once grand halls became shelters for animals, then ruins, then myths. Travelers recorded fragments, fallen columns, half-buried arches, often misunderstanding what they saw, yet sensing former greatness. Colonial expansion and industrialization accelerated loss. Ancient structures were dismantled for railways and factories. Urban growth swallowed old sites without ceremony. Archaeology, when it arrived, often came too late, rescuing only what could be measured and sketched. Yet even in decay, these buildings retained power. Artists painted them. Writers imagined their former splendor. Ruins became symbols of fallen empires, of warning, of nostalgia. The absence itself spoke loudly. Where a roof once soared, sky now entered freely. Where voices once echoed, wind took their place. Daily life adapted around the remains. Children played among stones older than their language. Markets set up beside collapsed walls. Sacred spaces became ordinary ground, their meanings diluted but not entirely erased. Memory lingered in names, in legends, in the way locals avoided or revered certain sites. The life of a building does not end when its walls fall. It continues in fragments, in influence, in the structures that borrow its ideas. Arches are repeated. Domes are reimagined. Proportions echo across centuries, carried forward by architects who may never know the original source. Conflict, change, and time dismantled these 10 buildings, but they did not erase them completely. Their stories survived, waiting for reconstruction not in stone, but in understanding. Every building has a moment when it stands at the center of its world. A completed dome catches light for the first time. A palace hosts a ceremony meant to be remembered forever. A temple opens its doors to thousands, its rituals aligning earth with heaven. These moments are brief, yet decisive. They define how history will remember what follows. For some of these lost buildings, the turning point came suddenly. A single night of fire, a decisive invasion, an earthquake that split walls open like parchment. In those moments, centuries of labor were undone in hours. Survivors remembered the sound, the collapse not as noise, but as finality. For others, decline was quieter. Power shifted elsewhere. Capitals moved. Trade routes dried up. The building remained, but its purpose hollowed out. Rooms went unused. Repairs were postponed. Grandeur faded not through violence, but through indifference. Yet legacy does not depend on survival alone. Some of the most influential buildings no longer exist at all. They live on through descriptions, drawings, and the structures they inspired. Architects study their proportions. Cities mirror their layouts. Religious spaces borrow their geometry. Even absence becomes instructional. Modern reconstruction, through scholarship, archaeology, and digital imagination, offers a second life. These lost buildings can now be walked through again, not with feet, but with understanding. Their colors are restored, their scale corrected, their context rebuilt. We see them not as isolated wonders, but as living environments shaped by human need and belief. What emerges is not nostalgia, but clarity. These buildings were not perfect. They were expensive, labor-intensive, often built on inequality. Their beauty coexisted with suffering. A palace's splendor rested on taxation and forced labor. A temple's serenity might conceal exclusion. Recognizing this complexity deepens their story rather than diminishing it. The legacy of these 10 buildings is ultimately human. They remind us that civilization is ambitious and fragile at once, that what seems permanent is often temporary, that every skyline is provisional. Stone remembers effort, not certainty. As modern cities rise in glass and steel, the vanished buildings of the past whisper caution and inspiration together. They urge us to build with care, to preserve with humility, and to remember that architecture is never just about shelter. It is about values made visible. When these buildings fell, history did not end. It shifted. New structures rose atop old foundations. Cultures adapted. Yet something irreplaceable was lost each time, a unique expression of how a society once understood the world. To reconstruct them is not to reclaim the past, but to listen to it. To stand, even briefly, within spaces that once defined empires and shaped lives. And to understand that what we build today will one day face the same question these buildings did. Will we be remembered for our endurance, or for what we dared to imagine?